How is everybody today? Well, we took a little break and probably going to take a little time to get wound up again. But during the break, I hope you did some reading. I didn't, but I hope you did some. uh, we're going to be going in our book by Paul Ramsey to a discussion of the meaning of Christian love. Now, obviously, everything we've done up to the present time has been in preparation for that. But since that's going to be your major thesis as you write, you might want to reread these chapters after we've talked about them a little bit, and so maybe things will make a little better sense. In the part of the book just previous to this chapter on the meaning of Christian love, he talks about the idea of a code, a law code. And most people think of ethics as a law code. And in fact, most people think of religious ethics as primarily a law code, and that's because historically, religious ethics has primarily been a law code. So that makes it difficult for people to even try to comprehend what the New Testament means by ethics that transcend the law. In fact, ethics that in a sense annuls the law. It doesn't annul the law in the sense that the law is not good. It annuls the law in the sense that at least from the perspective of New Testament theologians, such as Paul, the law is good, but it has proved ineffectual in bringing about a life which God intends His people to live. The law basically tells us that we are sinners. The law tells us that we cannot keep the law, and so we cannot continue from the New Testament perspective to continue to hold on to the law as the source of our life and as the source of our ethics. That doesn't mean that the law is of no value anymore. Paul, Augustine, Luther, Calvin all believed, of course, that Christians should study the Hebrew Bible, study the law of Moses, and know the law of Moses, and they expected their students to be able to repeat the Ten Commandments and to tell the stories of the Old Testament and tell the stories of how those commandments are elaborated in various situations that are not specifically encoded in the Ten Commandments themselves. So in that sense, the Ten Commandments themselves give you a hint that a complete ethic cannot be a code of ethics, because every generation, every individual, and every situation has to take the Ten Commandments and to take the general summary of the Ten Commandments, which is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, spirit, and strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Take those general commandments and live them in particular situations. And so that means that for Christian theologians, one of their favorite terms with respect to Christian ethics is Christian liberty. That is, Christians are free. Sometimes this is put in different ways. One saying that's attributed to Augustine is, love God and then do what you will. Do what you want to do, or do what you please. Well, if you really understand what it means to love God, then that is a true statement. Obviously, if you are still very confused or not very profound about your understanding of what it means to love God, then that's not a very good statement. Do as you please. The motto, for instance, of modern Wicca, you know who Wicca are. The motto of modern Wicca is, do what you will, only do no harm. Well, Well, how does that differ then from Augustine's statement to love and then to do as you please? Well, you have to understand that there is a different content in the Wicca expression, do no harm, from what there is in the Christian expression of love. And so that's what the Bible is for, that's what the study of the Bible is for, that's what the study of the history of Christian ethics is for, is to try to find out what that content is. And the New Testament's assumption is that that content is basically Jesus Christ and everything that Jesus Christ means. And we've already talked about the fact that that seems like an absolutist or a dogmatic statement. And in a sense, it is an absolutist or dogmatic statement. Not in the sense that Christian ethics is absolute or that Christians are absolute, but in the sense that God is absolute. And Jesus Christ, then, as the representative of God in human life, is his will is absolute. We always have to understand, as Paul said, that we look through a glass darkly. In other words, there is no way for Christians or anyone else, Christians or Jews, those people who have an ethic of God's righteousness, there's no way for them to assume that the righteousness which they are trying to produce is a righteousness that comes from themselves. They always have to reflect that the righteousness that they're involved in is the righteousness of God. And so the argument against either Jewish righteousness or Christian righteousness, that it is somehow a self-righteous concept, is wide of the mark. It is absolutely true that a great many Jews and Christians are self-righteous. It's also absolutely true that a great many secular humanists and atheists are self-righteous. And we don't like, generally, self-righteousness, whether we see it in an atheist or a secular humanist or a Christian or a Jew or anyone else. But, and so self-righteousness is not the goal of Christian ethics any more than it's the goal of humanistic ethics. Self-righteousness, in fact, it's the goal of Christian ethics to overcome self-righteousness and to give self-righteousness no possible credit. We cannot brag on ourselves as, from the biblical perspective, a person cannot brag on himself or herself as if they were the production, or they were the ones who produced the righteousness. Therefore, from the as Ramsey tries to say, for Christian ethics, the law, written law, is not adequate to accomplish righteousness. It is good in itself, but it's not adequate to accomplish righteousness. But also the law written in the heart that Paul talks about Gentiles having, even if they are not Jews, is not adequate for accomplishing what righteousness calls for. And so somehow or another we have to look beyond ourselves for whatever power that might bring us into the kind of righteousness that that Christianity expects. Now, if there is no God, and if Jesus Christ is not what Christians believe that he is, then there is no place to get that power. And so basically what we're saying is, if you want to call it a language game, call it a language game. But if you're going to try to understand what Christian ethics is, you have to at least play the language game far enough to say that we can't do this without a belief that there is a righteous God and that Jesus is the righteousness of God. Obviously, a Christian theologian would not consider that just to be a language game. But what I'm saying is, if we're going to understand Christian ethics, we can't understand it by beginning on some other basis. Now, so somehow or another, Jesus Christ, for Christians, has produced the basis for understanding what we're to do and what we're to be. Now, at the beginning of your chapter on the meaning of Christian love, we run into Soren Kierkegaard again. You remember that existentialist. And also Paul Tillich, who is a more recent existentialist Christian theologian. And listen to what they have to say. A man would no more be able to live exclusively according to the highest Christian concepts all the time than he would be able to live by eating only at the Lord's table. That is the criticism that is made against Christian ethics by some other religious ethics. For instance, sometimes the relationship between Jewish and Muslim and Christian ethics are put in a certain oversimplistic way. And I don't say that this is the way it should be understood, but this is the way it's sometimes put. Muslim ethics has both justice and mercy, but Muslim ethics tends toward heaviness on justice. Christian ethics, theoretically, has both justice and mercy, but Christian ethics tends heavily on the merciful. That doesn't mean that Christians are always merciful, but the ethics that they understand to be Christian ethics tends toward the merciful. And supposedly Judaism is kind of in between and has a kind of a proper balance of justice and mercy. Well, obviously, that might be an adequate characterization from some people's perspective, but from the Christian perspective, the justice of God and His mercy cannot be distinguished, particularly since the justice of God or the righteousness of God, according to Christians, is now seen in Jesus Christ. That means that the way we treat other people will be done in the light of the way God treats us, whether the way God treats other people, and the way Jesus Christ treats other people. Paul Tillich adds to the inadequacy here, or talks more about the inadequacy of Christian definition of love. I have given no definition of love. Just like he gives no definition of existentialism, he gives no definition of love. This is impossible, because there is no higher principle by which it could be defined. In other words, you can't just define love in the Christian sense. You have to kind of move around it, circle around it, and try to identify the content of it. Because Christian love primarily has to do with the way in which we understand the nature of God and who our neighbor is. Christ does not talk about knowing one's neighbor, but about oneself being a neighbor, as the Samaritan proved himself one by his compassion. Now, the whole story of the Good Samaritan, with which you may be familiar or you may not be familiar, I'll just have to go over it and see what Ramsey's trying to say here. The whole story of the Good Samaritan comes up when there is a theological, ethical discussion about what is the greatest commandment. And Jesus agrees with the rabbis that the greatest commandment is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, and spirit. And he agrees with the rabbis that the second greatest commandment is that you should love your neighbor as yourself. So one of the scripture experts on this occasion asked the question, who is my neighbor? which is another question that's a question that's being continuously asked in these theological ethical discussions in the first century in Jerusalem and in Palestine or in Israel. Who is my neighbor? Well, Jesus was well acquainted with these discussions, and he knew that probably the lawyer could give you a list of who your neighbors are. And it would be a list that depended upon the people that surrounded you. For instance, obviously your kinfolks would be your neighbor in the sense that you should take care of them. And then obviously fellow Jews, that is observant Jews, righteous Jews, should be your neighbor in that you should take care of them. And perhaps even other Jews who were not particularly righteous might be your neighbor, and you should pay attention to them. But after a while, the number of neighbors on the list kind of comes to an end. It drops off. So Jesus knew which people were not on that Bible scholar's list of neighbors. So he didn't turn to him and said, well, now let me tell you, your family, you know, the priests and the Pharisees and all of the good people in Jerusalem and Israel, and then maybe the poor. But what about the people that you call the people of the land, the sinners? What about Gentiles that are in your communities? Because there were a lot of Gentiles in Israel at the time. Not just Roman soldiers, but pagans that had come in and settled in some of these big Roman cities, like Sepphoris, which was outside of Nazareth, which was one of the biggest cities there. But Jesus doesn't try to get into an argument with the man about who should go on the list, because one of the people who should not go on the list definitely was the Samaritan. So, Jesus just tells a story. As I've tried to indicate over and over again, the Bible is a story, and if you want to understand the Bible story, you have to listen to the story. We've talked about the story of the prodigal son. And the story of the Good Samaritan is another one of those stories in the New Testament that is very important for understanding the content of Christian ethics. He said there was a man who was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among thieves. Roads during that time were kind of like roads are becoming again. There were people all over the roads waiting for somebody to come by that they could rob. And so it was a very chancy thing for somebody to go alone from Jerusalem down to Jericho. It was a very small road, and it was very, it went along cliffs, and there was no way to run in many different directions. So he was robbed, and he was beaten, and he was left in the ditch. Now, it doesn't tell us who robbed him, whether the people that robbed him were Jews or whether they were Samaritans. It doesn't make any difference. But this man was a Jew, the one who was robbed. Now, Jesus is now expecting someone to come along. And two guys do come along. One is a priest, and he's going up to Jerusalem. And he has a big job, a very important job. He's the one who offers the sacrifices for the people so that always the repentance of the people can be kept before God, and the seriousness of the sin of the people can be kept before God. But the sacrifice also symbolizes the mercy of God for his people. And so he probably has a lot to do, and he may even be late. But Jesus doesn't discuss what's going on in the man's mind, because from the perspective of the story that Jesus is telling, it's really irrelevant what's going on in the man's mind. What is relevant is what you can see him do. And what do you see him do? He just walks on by on the other side. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he is a horrible character. People do that every day in Houston. You know, I've found myself doing it. Have you ever found yourself doing it? Sometimes when I'm late from teaching class, I'll get out on the street out here on Cullen and take off down toward the red light. And there will be some person in an old car that just goes doop, 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 boop, you know, and it's just stopped there right in the middle of the street. Well, when I was younger and lived out in the country, you would never pass somebody up like that. You would stop and try to make sure that that person got whatever they needed. Usually, out in the country, you could actually help fix the car. You know, my father was a mechanic. I used to be a mechanic, so I could have probably helped fix the car. But even if you couldn't fix the car, you could take that person someplace and get some help. And people have done that to me all the time. I'd be stopped on a highway way out in the middle of nowhere out in West Texas, and I'd just get outside and somebody would stop and pick me up, and I did the same thing. So that's kind of a tradition in American automobile culture for a long time. In fact, there were even some laws passed that required people to do that. Those were called Good Samaritan laws. Now, Good Samaritan laws are very hard to have these days. They're very hard to enforce because unless you yourself are involved in an accident, if you're involved in an accident yourself, then you're required to stay and try to see if you can help. But even if you stay, you probably better not do very much because you could get sued. And that's certainly true in terms of getting involved in something that you are not yourself a party of. And then there's also the problem that some of these people who are disabled have deliberately disabled themselves so they can get your car, or they can get your money or whatever. So this is a very difficult thing to do. Perhaps the priest was worried that the robbers were not very far away and that they were just setting him up. Whatever the reason, the priest goes by on the other side, and Jesus doesn't call him names or say what a horrible person he is. He just says he went around on the other side. Then there comes a Levite, and the Levite is a member of the tribe, which is the supporting tribe of the priesthood. So he is the one who does all the ordinary manual labor that makes sure that the priesthood operates functionally. So he also has a big job. And he's also a righteous man, or he should be a righteous man. And yet he also finds that it's really going to be a lot of trouble if I don't go around on the other side. Well, if you'll notice so far in the story, Jesus is not psychoanalyzing anybody like we usually do. We usually try to figure out why the man did that. Well, I can kind of psychoanalyze myself as to why I do it. And after I just kind of drive around this car and go on, I usually feel kind of a guilty conscience a couple of blocks away, but it's too late to turn around and go back, you see. So we psychologize ourselves and we psychologize people in the Bible, but the Bible doesn't psychologize its people. Because the love that Jesus is talking about is not a psychological state. It is an action. So the third man that comes along is a Samaritan. And the Samaritan is deliberately picked. That is, Jesus deliberately picked a Samaritan. Because it wouldn't have done any good. He wouldn't have really got his point across if he'd have picked another Jew. Because Jews were already on the list. When somebody asked, who is my neighbor, the Jews were already on the list. So Jesus picked someone who is not on the list. Anyway, he says the Samaritan stopped and he picked up the man, he treated his wounds, he gave him some wine to drink, and got him back on his transportation, and took him down to an inn closer to the bottom of the hill. And he put the man in the inn and gave the innkeeper a certain amount of money so that he could take care of him. And if you need more money, that is, if you spend more money taking care of him, I'll make it up to you when I come back. Well, what was the motive of the Samaritan? You know, was he trying to get his Eagle Scout badge? was he a person who just wanted people to feel like that he was an outstanding good person? Jesus doesn't say what his motivation was, because that's irrelevant. He gets to the end of the story then, and then he says, now I'm going to list for you who your neighbors are. Is that what he does? No, he doesn't do that. What he does is ask a question that the lawyer or the biblical scholar is not waiting for, is not prepared for. His question is, who is the neighbor in that story? Well, when you ask the question, who is my neighbor, you generally ask it so you can know whether I, a righteous person, am under obligation to help him if he's in trouble. But when Jesus uses the word neighbor, he's not talking about the person that I should help. He's talking about me. In other words, what he's saying is that in that story, the Samaritan is the neighbor. And the Samaritan is not even in any trouble. But the Samaritan doesn't have a list. We don't know why he didn't. But he does not have a list of who he's supposed to help and who he's not supposed to help. If he had had that list, a Jew lying by the side of the road would certainly not have been on it. So what he does is he sees a human being, and he does not calculate as to whether this human being deserves my help. He doesn't calculate as to whether this human being can actually pay me back. That is not part of his calculation. His calculation is simply, there is a person who is in need. I don't have anything to do that is more important than this right now. So I am going to be a neighbor. So in that story then, Jesus redefines what being a neighbor is. He takes it away from list making, and he puts the burden on every individual who hears the story. Now we have to do the same thing in our culture, because most of us wouldn't care whether the person was a Samaritan or not. That's not part of our problem. Our problem comes to some other kinds of situations. For instance, our problem comes from stories like when my mother used to pick cotton when I was a child, and a great many of the people that picked cotton with her were illegal immigrants from Mexico. We lived right on the border. And she was out picking cotton in the field one day, and this woman from across the field just kind of screamed and fell down. And my mother went and tried to find out what was wrong with her. And she was just screaming. She was just in such pain she couldn't do anything. So my mother ran up to the house and got in an old car and drove it out into the field and helped her into the car and drove about 30 miles to the nearest hospital. She got to the hospital and took the woman and finally got somebody to come out and carry the woman into the hospital. And my mother was a kind of naive. She thought that the hospital was going to help that woman. You know, we still have stories like this all the time, but a story like this was not uncommon at all during this period. But the fact of the matter is that because this woman was obviously an alien, what people in those days at those times called a wetback, then she was first of all going to be put kind of at the end of the line. But second, since she obviously had no money whatever, she was going to keep being put back at the end of the line. So they finally told my mother. My mother finally went up and complained, and somebody said, well, she can't be admitted unless she has $5. Well, my mother had been sitting there for quite a while with that woman screaming, and they hadn't told her that. So she went and jumped back in the car, drove back 30 miles to her hometown, and went around the country, stopping at houses, trying to get people to give her some money. And after going to a whole bunch of different houses, she collected $5, which was a lot of money at that time. Went back up to the hospital, and they got the $5, and so they finally took the woman in. And she had a burst appendix. Well, that had a ultimately good outcome, because my mother that very day vowed that she was going to become a nurse, and so she became a nurse. And when she retired, she was vice president of the Valley Baptist Medical Center. And so that one little experience introduced her to the idea of how to be a neighbor. On the other hand, there are other stories. For instance, I forget his name, the name of the man who invented the technique of producing blood plasma during World War I. And because of his invention of this technique, he saved the lives of tens of thousands of Americans during the war. And not long after the war, he was in some kind of accident, had to be taken to the hospital. But when he got to the hospital, he was turned away because he was black. In other words, here was the man who had invented blood plasma, and he went to a hospital and he couldn't get it. That shows that human beings have not changed since the time of Jesus. They've just changed in who they have on the list and who they don't have on the list. And what are some of the people? Who are some of the people today in America that might not be on somebody's list to help? In other words, if you got 4 or 5 people sitting in a line, and you want to prioritize people, who are some of the people that in some areas of the country would not be put on the list? In other words, you would only help them if there was nobody else to help. Well, during, of course, the time of Jim Crow laws, which was the time this man died because he couldn't get blood transfusion, all kinds of migrant workers, blacks who had been former slaves, Hispanics, other kinds of Eastern Europeans and so forth that had come into America. They really had a hard time getting medical attention. And we still have that problem, but it's not near as much as it used to be. In some places in America, up until recently, people like gays or homosexuals would have a hard time if it was known. So what happens in every culture is that there are lists of people. And so by telling this one story, Jesus basically eliminated the possibility of a Christian keeping a list of people who can be helped or should be helped before somebody else. So the Samaritan proved himself to be a neighbor by his compassion, not by his race, not by his nationality. but by his compassion. For by his compassion he did not prove that the man attacked was his neighbor, but that he was the neighbor of the one who was assaulted. So the parable actually shows the nature and meaning of Christian love, which alone of all ethical standpoints discovers the neighbor, because it alone begins with neighborly love and not with discriminating between worthy and unworthy people according to the qualities they possess. Christian love, attributing worth to the neighbor's needs, infinitely superior to the claims of self, does not rest upon a doctrine of the infinite inherent value of human personality in general. Now, in the West, we are kind of proud of the idea of the infinite value of the individual, and there's certainly nothing wrong with the idea of the infinite value of the individual. But you can have a conception of the infinite value of the individual and still not do what you're supposed to do. In other words, the people who turned these people away from the hospital probably had an intellectual idea of the infinite value of the individual. But when they saw an infinite valuable individual, it was probably one of their children or one of their kinfolks or somebody that was close to them. And they can feel, they can really feel how valuable those persons are. But the Samaritan story tells us that somebody is not operating simply on the basis of some intellectual principle. He's operating on the basis of need. What is the need? That's all I need to know. What is the need? Because if it was based on the inherent value of human personality, such a doctrine would logically lead to subtracting from obligation as much as the just claims of self require. And that may be what the priest was doing. That may be what the Levite was doing, because they have a right to take care of themselves. The Samaritan had a right to take care of himself, but the Samaritan did not take care of himself. He was totally oblivious. Well, we don't know if he was oblivious, but at least he acted as though he were totally oblivious to whatever dangers that might be to himself, or how much money he was going to lose, or how much time he was going to lose, and how much time he was not going to be able to be with his family, and all of those different possibilities. Because if the purpose, or if the reason why you treat human beings in such a way is because they are worthy of being treated that way because of their infinite value, then you already have an infinite valuable human being to take care of, namely yourself. So that brings us to the question of loving your neighbor as yourself. We'll talk about that a little later. But never in the Bible is it said that neighbor includes enemy. There are some statements in the Bible that you should love your enemy. But the Bible doesn't say that neighbor includes the enemy among those who ought to be loved because they are human beings, but rather that love for another for his own sake. Neighborly love, in the Christian sense, discovers the neighbor in every man it meets, and as such has never yet met a friend or an enemy. Because that's part of the listing, you see. You're walking down the street and you see somebody, and because of the way he dresses, you know that he is a friend. Or because of the way he dresses, you know that he's an enemy. Or because of the way he looks, you know he's a friend. Or because of the way he looks, you know he's an enemy. Or you're walking down a country road during a war, and you see someone that has obvious signs of being friendly to you. You see someone who has obvious signs of being an enemy to you. Those discriminations are also irrelevant. That doesn't mean that you should stick your head out and let some enemy shoot it. But it does mean that whether it's in time of war, whether it's in time of peace, whatever time it's in, if you see someone in need, whose need you can fulfill, then from the biblical perspective, that is your obligation. And there have been lots of people who have put this ethic into play even during wartime. In fact, doctors and medics are kind of committed to this ethic during wartime. They haven't always been true to it. But the general assumption is that even the ordinary American soldier or sailor or Air Force person is also committed to this ethic. Well, that's a very high ethic to be committed to. And so it's hard to expect people to easily do it. And so that's what it means when Kierkegaard says a man would no more be able to live exclusively according to the highest Christian concepts all the time than he would be able to live by eating only at the Lord's table. Well, the question is then, we got to go back and find out if this Christian ethic is so impossible, then why even talk about it? Why even try to get people to commit themselves to it? That brings us back to something that I was discussing several weeks ago. Sometimes people are kind of jealous of people who have a high ethical standard, because they know that the high ethical standard sounds good, but they also know that most people, including people who have high ethical standards, cannot always, at all times, live up to those standards. So what do they call these people? What do we usually, in our culture, what do we usually call a person who we know preaches one thing but doesn't live up to it? We call them hypocrites. And the interesting thing is that that's one of the things that makes it very difficult for modern people to understand the nature of Christian ethics. Because the Bible talks about hypocrites, but it doesn't mean, that's not what it means by hypocrite. When the Bible talks about a person being a hypocrite, it doesn't mean that a person does not live up to his highest standards. A hypocrite in the Bible means someone who doesn't live up to his high standards but claims he does, or puts it out as though he does, lets people think he does. In other words, that is a self-righteousness. So in the biblical sense, hypocrisy is a self-righteousness. It's wearing a mask. Now, if you have to be afraid of being called a hypocrite, simply if you try to live up, if you try to understand and live up to a certain ethical standard, then that's not fair. You've got to, if you can live up to an ethical standard perfectly at all times, then what does that tell you about that ethical standard? That it's not very high. If I have an ethical standard, for instance, that all this week I will not shoot anybody, I will not go to a bar and get drunk and break up the chairs, and maybe 2 or 3 other things. I set that as my standard for this week. And then at the end of the week I could say, look, I've lived up to my ethical standard. Or if I have as my ethical standard that I'm going to be completely fair and just to everybody. That sounds like an even better one. I'm going to be completely fair and just to everybody. If the Samaritan had had that standard, he could possibly have walked by on the other side just like the priest and the Levite. Because there's no justice of ordinary human justice that requires that you stop and help that man, particularly when it might be of danger to you and so forth. In other words, you have the right of self-defense, you have the right of self-preservation, you have the right to make sure that the money that belongs to you and your family does not necessarily go someplace else. So the Samaritan and the priest and the Levite could have had a fairly high standard, but it was one that they could very easily live in accordance with. But it's obvious that the standard that the Samaritan lived by was a little bit harder to live with. And it may be that at times he didn't live up to it. But that does not make him a hypocrite. What makes him a hypocrite is if he claims to live up to high moral standards, but does not. And that leaves us with only one solution to hypocrisy, and that is to make no such claims. Because any such claim is a falsehood. Any claim that you live up to the highest of biblical standards of ethics is a false claim. And that's the reason why the concept of repentance and the concept of grace and the concept of mercy always have to be a part of Christian ethics just as much as the concept of justice. In other words, the concept of justice in the ordinary sense won't do it. It's hard enough to live up to justice. It's even harder to live up to compassion. Okay, does anybody have a question or a comment about any of this? So in the story of the Good Samaritan, the original question was, who is my neighbor? And Jesus radically transforms it. Christ does not talk about knowing one's neighbor, but about oneself being a neighbor. There are also some good quotes in this chapter from some other existentialist theologians, such as Dostoevsky. You ever heard of Dostoevsky? Dostoevsky was one of those Christian existentialists who was well known, but a lot of people do not put two and two together to understand that almost all of the original existentialists were Christian existentialists. And here's what Dostoevsky has one woman say in his book, The Brothers Karamazov. The more I love humanity in general, the less I love man in particular. In my dream, this is a man who's saying this. In my dream, I have often come to making enthusiastic schemes for the service of humanity. And perhaps I might actually have faced crucifixion if it had been suddenly necessary. Yet I am incapable of living in the same room with any one of you, or with anyone for 2 days together. As I know by experience, as soon as anyone is near me, his personality disturbs my self-complacency and restricts my freedom. In 24 hours, I begin to hate the best of men. One because he's too long over his dinner, another because he has a cold and keeps on blowing his nose. I become hostile to people the moment they come close to me, but it always happens that the more I detest men individually, the more ardent becomes my love for humanity. I could never understand how one can love one's neighbors. It's just one's neighbors, to my mind, that one can't love. Though one might love those at a distance. For anyone to love a man, he must be hidden. For as soon as he shows his face, love is gone. Beggars, especially genteel beggars, ought never to show themselves, but to ask for charity through the newspaper. One can love one's neighbors in the abstract, or even at a distance, but at close quarters, it's almost impossible. Now, this is what another theologian named Charles Schulz had in mind when he wrote in his comic strip Peanuts, something that I've probably already told you, that Lucy is going around screaming at the other kids, "You should love mankind, Charlie Brown. You should love mankind." And Charlie Brown is kind of sad, and he throws up his arms and he says, "I love mankind. It's just the people I can't stand." So Charlie Brown and Peanuts carried over the, I don't know how many decades he did this comic strip, the same kind of Christian existentialist questions, and dealt with some of the same kind of things that people like Søren Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky dealt with. Kierkegaard talks about the need for love being disinterested, and we've used that word a number of times. That doesn't mean uninterested. In other words, you don't have to be uninterested in somebody to help them. But in order to show Christian love, you have to be disinterested. If we wish to assure ourselves, this is Kierkegaard, if we wish to assure ourselves that love is entirely disinterested, we must remove every possibility of requital. What does requital mean? We must remove every possibility that I'm going to get paid back. And that is based on a number of other stories that Jesus told. Because, for instance, he would say, if you're going to have a big dinner and invite somebody in to enjoy your dinner, don't invite people who are rich like you and who can give another big dinner next week and invite you, and so you get paid back. That's what we do all the time. You know, that's what I do. I go out to lunch with people, and I go out to lunch with people regularly, and I'll buy their lunch. The reason why I buy their lunch is because I know they are well off enough to next time we go eat, he'll buy my lunch. And that's wonderful. There's nothing wrong with that, except that Christians should not have that much time because they should be trying to find someone to feed who will not be able to pay them back. So that's what Kierkegaard means. We must remove every possibility of requital. But this is exactly what happens with respect to the dead. If love persists notwithstanding this, then it is in truth disinterested. Now Kierkegaard, makes all of these extravagant analogies, and the extravagant analogy he's making here is that if you want to know what disinterested love is, try to imagine loving somebody who is dead. In other words, if you could, you would do anything for that person, even if you didn't know him. But if you did do something for that person, what would you expect back? You wouldn't expect anything back. And so what he's saying is that that's the way our relationship should be in our love toward other people. We should love someone as if he were dead and could not do anything. He couldn't even acknowledge our goodness. He couldn't even brag on us for doing him good. He couldn't even say thank you. He certainly couldn't pay us back. If you therefore wish to prove whether you love disinterestedly, then sometimes pay attention to how you behave toward the dead. Much love, unquestionably the most, if subjected to a sharper testing, would appear to be selfishness. But the fact of the matter is that in a love relationship between the living, there's always a hope and a prospect of requital, at least of a reciprocated love, and generally speaking, this is what happens. But this hope, this prospect, together with the requital, produces such an effect that one cannot definitely see what is love and what is selfishness. And that attaches to a great deal of what we call charitable contributions and so forth. Luther used to make the statement that even good works are sinful. Now that sounds kind of pessimistic, but what he meant by that was that even our best intentions are mixed. Suppose if you look around the university, for instance, every one of these buildings has a name on it. Well, if you go to the University of Houston, of course, you're very glad that there was somebody who had enough money and resources to give money so that we could have these buildings and all of these books and all this to work with. So it's not saying anything bad about these people to say that they have given this money. They could have kept it. And there are a lot of people who keep it and who do not bring anything to try to give back to their community. But what Luther is saying is that even when you give something like this, you can't claim it as making you a superior ethical human being. Because for one thing, almost all of these gifts are acknowledged by naming the building after you. And sometimes people even require that the building be named after them before they would give the money. Now there's another way to do this, and that's to do it anonymously. But notice what Luther means by even our good works are sinful. Because when you give something anonymously, you may have tried this before if you haven't tried it. Give something anonymously to somebody who really needs it. And then try to feel totally disinterested. What you hope is that they will get this money, that you will have given it anonymously, and so that is a much higher level person than somebody who gives it so that the building can be named for him. But you hope that he finds out that you did it. You understand what I'm saying? You wouldn't mind if the person that you gave anonymously to found out about it, because there still is some self-interest in all human actions. And so that's what Kierkegaard means by the fact that you really can't all the time, in every way, live up to this Christian ethic. But that doesn't mean that the Christian ethic does not remain as the ideal, though that's not the word that Christian ethics would use, as the goal. Hopefully, in the eschaton, we will have grown to the point where we could actually give because of a person's need only, and not also for our own needs. You know, there's the expression, it's more blessed to give than to receive. And that is probably a true expression. In fact, it's found in the book of Acts, and it says that this is what Jesus said. This was the only saying, one of the only sayings that is attributed to Jesus that doesn't come from the Gospels. It comes from another book. And there is a sense in which it is more blessed to give than to receive. That is, you're going to be happier if you give than if you receive. But that's not the reason why you're obligated to give. In other words, that's not the reason why you give. It's so that you'll be happier. You give because that's not a disinterested gift. You give because of the need of someone else. Now that is a stark, we don't want to hear that kind of ethic, because we want to feel good about it. We want to feel good about everything we do. But it has to be that stark, because if we want to continue to feel good about everything that we do for people, then we're not going to do things for most people. So neighborly love in the Christian sense discovers the neighbor in every man it meets, every human being it meets, and as such has never yet met a friend or an enemy. Love for men or people in general often means merely a bifocal, self-regarding concern for others, a selfish sociability. And this is often what people consider to be very generous. For me to give something to somebody because they are very attractive to me. You know, guys will give a 1 or 2 carat diamond ring to a girl, and somebody will say, well, boy, he's generous. You ought to get a hold of him. And that may be generous, but that's not what love means in the Christian sense. Love means giving something that somebody needs, even though that person may not be attractive to us. So, love of neighbor for his own sake insists upon a single-minded orientation of a man's primary intention toward this individual neighbor with all his concrete needs. Christian love means an entirely neighbor-regarding concern for others, which begins with the first man it sees. Since this man may be any man, such love is, of course, universal in compass, but only implicitly universal. It begins by loving the neighbor, not mankind or manhood. Or, to put it more like Jesus says, it begins by being a neighbor. So if you love your neighbor, then you might go down the street and say, well, this guy is my neighbor, this guy's not, this guy's my neighbor, this guy's not. If I am the neighbor walking down the street, then what do I see? He's my neighbor, he's my neighbor, he's my neighbor, he's my neighbor. Everybody that I see is my neighbor, because I am the neighbor. For the fact of the matter is that in a love relationship between persons who have a personal or national affinity for one another, there is always a hope and a prospect of requital, at least of reciprocated love, and generally speaking, this is what happens in due time. But precisely this hope, this prospect of requital, having something named after you, or somebody's sending you a note saying how wonderful you are, is not far distant, in the not far distant future, produces such an effect that one cannot definitely see what is Christian love and what is enlightened selfishness. Because one cannot see quite definitely whether requital is expected or not, or whether the neighbor is loved for his own sake or not. So a similar understanding of the nature and meaning of Christian love follows upon a consideration of the commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. The words as yourself do not indicate how much love, or for that matter, that any amount of love may be withheld. Instead, they describe the sort of love Christians should give each other. Now, this is a very controversial point, and you may want to disagree with it and may want to have some discussion about it. But Christian love depends on the direction of the will, the orientation of intention in an act, not on stirring emotion. Now, every time in various settings, when I talk about the fact that Christian love is not an emotion, people get very emotional about that because they want Christian love to be an emotion. They want to feel tingly when they love somebody. And there's nothing wrong with feeling tingly if you love somebody. You know, I spent this last week with my grandchildren. One of them is 6 years old, one of them is 6 weeks old. And you know, you kind of feel tingly when you're showing love to somebody like that. Whereas if somebody else's brat, you know, is causing you trouble, you may not feel very tingly about that. So there's nothing wrong with feeling tingly. In fact, you ought to feel tingly about when you're trying to help some other person's child. But at the same time, that's not yet risen to Christian love. That's a natural love. It's a wonderful love. There's nothing wrong with it. But it's not yet risen to Christian love. Because Christian love is not primarily based on emotion. It's certainly not based on a positive emotion. For instance, how do you love your enemy with a positive emotion. If you have to get up a positive emotion before you love your enemy, when will you love him? Never. That's what it means to be an enemy. So the commandment requires the Christian to aim at his neighbor's good just as unswervingly as man by nature wishes his own good. Now, there's a lot of interest in what these days in what Ramsey calls coalition ethics. Persons interested in coalition ethics frequently fasten upon the words "as yourself," interpreting them as a tribute to the positive ethical value of love for self in Christian ethics. This comes primarily from modern pop psychology and even psychology that's not pop psychology, because a psychologist is trying to deal with your self-image. He's trying to deal with the fact that you have low self-esteem. And so this passage is taken from the New Testament to try to say, you should have high self-esteem. Well, that's true. You should have high self-esteem. But just quoting this passage is not going to give you high self-esteem. You know, you're going to have to get high self-esteem from someplace else. You're going to have to understand that that high self-esteem is not based on your brains or your courage or whatever it is that gives people high self-esteem. Your estimate of yourself should be based on how God estimates you from the Christian perspective. And God estimates every human being as of infinite value. And so the promotion of good self-esteem has to begin very early in a human being's life. If it doesn't, then it's going to be hard to get it back. And self-esteem should be encouraged in all children. Parents should learn how to do that and should learn how to protect their children from assaults on their self-esteem. But that's not what Jesus is talking about, self-esteem. He's talking about, because we don't have to be commanded to esteem ourselves. We have to learn to esteem ourselves, but we don't have to be commanded to esteem ourselves. But we do have to be commanded to love our neighbors. In other words, we have to be commanded to put out as much effort for the good of someone else as we would put out for ourselves. And even people with very low self-esteem put out a lot of effort for themselves. Because a person with very low self-esteem can still have what Augustine calls pride. That is, inordinate self-centeredness. And in fact, that's what a lot of psychologists don't recognize, is that if you've got somebody in your office and you're observing him clinically and you say, well, this guy is an arrogant so-and-so. He is filled with arrogance and pride. Well, this person here is kind of a wimp. He has no self-esteem. He is embarrassed about himself. He is ashamed about himself. He is not assertive about himself. And he says, look, he doesn't have any pride. Well, the psychologist is using the word pride in a different sense from what the Christian theologian is using. From the Christian theologian's perspective, the man who is arrogant and always standing up for his rights and fighting, and the man who will not stand up for his rights and who is bashful and so forth, both of them have the problem of pride. That is, they are self-centered. And both of them, in order to be healed, have to be directed away from themselves. If you are timid, the way to get over your timidity is to direct yourself away from yourself toward other people, because being timid means that you feel inadequate in the face of other people, and there's no real objective reason why you should feel inadequate in the face of other people, because God has given you equal value. But in order to get rid of your timidity, you're going to have to face away from yourself. So that's what theologians mean by saying that all sin is based in pride. It's based in inordinate self-centeredness. And that's been my experience psychologically. When I was a kid, I was extremely shy. I'm still pretty shy. It's easier for me to talk to 100 people or 1,000 people than it is to talk to one person. I'm getting better at it because my wife has trained me since we've been married. But when we got married, we kind of had a mixed marriage. Both of us were white, and both of us were descendants of Scots-Irish people, and all of us spoke English, and all of us were from Texas. But we still had a cultural difference, because her family were a bunch of loudmouths that just always talked, had their mouth open all the time, yelling and screaming and laughing, and I mean, not screaming at each other, but laughing and being very loud. My family was a kind of a hillbilly family, so if you went to our house, it was just real quiet. Nobody ever said anything unless they had to. And when my wife first went home for Christmas, when I first took her home for Christmas, I got up one morning and went out in the car, and she was sitting in the car crying. And I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "Well, your parents hate me." And I said, "Well, what makes you think my parents hate me?" They were overjoyed that I was able to get somebody. And anyway, she said, "Well, your father came downstairs and fixed breakfast and never said a word to me." Well, good night. The fact that my father went down and fixed her breakfast, it didn't dawn on her that this was his way of showing, how excited he was to have her there. Because my father didn't go down and fix breakfast very often. And then she said, "Well, they don't have my name on any of the Christmas presents." I said, "Carol, did you notice that there were no names on any of the Christmas presents?" Because that's the tradition in my family. The tradition in my family, which, goes back I don't know how far, is that you do not put names on the presents under the Christmas tree, because you want to have the joy of picking up the present and giving it, of recognizing which present goes to who and giving it to them. But you do that without saying anything. In other words, people have different cultures. And in my culture, I grew up extremely shy. And the reason why I was extremely shy is because I was so self-centered, if you understand what I'm saying. Because I kind of felt like that I didn't have anything that anybody else wanted to hear. I always thought everybody else was better than I was, smarter than I was, and so forth. And so what that was an inordinate focus on myself. If I'd have just let go and treated people as equals, then everything would have been better. So the idea that you're to love yourself is fine. But that's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus, in fact, is saying that in a sense, your old self has to die and to be born again before it can be lovable. So that means there is no commandment in the Bible to love yourself. There's no need for a commandment to love yourself. There's a need of a commandment to love others, because you won't naturally do that. The as yourself of the commandment ought never to be understood as if the individual remains somewhat on this side of the chasm, separating him from his neighbor, or as if he merely divides the ground between them, adjusting self-regarding and other regarding sentiments in a 50-50 or some other portion. In fact, you may dislike yourself so much that you won't treat yourself as well as you'll treat a stranger. And so you just need to get rid of all of this calculation. And once you get rid of that calculation, then you can do what God wants you to do toward other people according to the New Testament. and you don't have to worry about all the thinking that goes on before you do something. Okay, next time what we're going to do is just basically summarize what we've said about the nature of Christian love.